few days ago, Hamas spokesman Abu Zuri announced all Israelis have now become legitimate targets. Well, that's hardly really a policy change, since they've been targeting all civilians from Israel for years. But with all the talk about how Israel should behave, it's instructive to look at the quote and remember that Hamas considers every Israeli, including children, to be legitimate targets. Israel has chosen another path. IDF spokesman Peter Lerner said, "We use everything at hand to try to avoid and avert civilian casualties. We phone up our enemies and tell them that we're going to blow up the building. We throw non-explosive munitions, and that is a sign they're supposed to vacate the building. Only once we have seen them vacate the building, and we are talking about command and control places, not the terrorists themselves. Then we hit. In any strategic operation, surprise is a major advantage. Can you imagine an NFL quarterback inviting the defense into his huddle so they can be informed about what play he's going to call? That's what Israel is doing in Gaza. Writing in the liberal Slate magazine, William Salatin praised the Israeli efforts to minimize civilian casualties as a possible example for future conflicts. He wrote, "The terrorist work-from-home rationale raises ugly problems for the rules of war. Israel's warning procedures, however, could become a model. You can accuse Israel of striking houses, but they're actually hitting military infrastructure that, for propaganda purposes, the enemy has placed in civilian neighborhoods. Israel first hits with a noisy, non-explosive bang on the roof, then gives plenty of time for the people to get out before sending the destructive strike. Hamas leaders head for the hills, but try to get many civilians in harm's way as they can. They can't match Israel on the battlefield, so they depend on propaganda. They create large numbers of civilian casualties that their allies in the media use as ammunition against Israel. Even former President Bill Clinton exposed their strategy. In an interview with India's NDTV, he said that the high civilian death toll was likely part of Hamas's barbaric plan. He said Hamas has a strategy designed to force Israel to kill their own civilians so that the rest of the world will condemn them." In Europe, there have been violent protests of Israel's actions in Gaza. Because of Europe's negative population growth, they have been importing laborers from the Muslim world for several years. According to the CIA fact books, Muslims now make up as much as 10% of the population of France, about 5% of the British. And that's not enough to win an election, but if you add in the usual Jew-hating fellow citizens, it's enough to stir up some enormous riots. In London, one speaker would yell, "From the river to the sea," and the crowd would respond, "Palestine will be free." They're talking about the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. They're calling for the obliteration of Israel, just another European attempt at genocidal final solution for the Jews. On MSNBC, Melissa Harris Perry interviewed a Palestinian journalist who told of traumatized children throughout Gaza. Before going to a commercial break, Harris Perry said, with apparent anger, "When I come back, I want to talk to my friend and colleague Amani Jamal about this question of the lived experience and whether or not you can justify this kind of war." After the break, Amani Jamal continued and blamed Israel for everything, but they never answered the question, can you justify this kind of war? Part of the Allied effort to win World War II was a carpet bombing of Germany. Look at the pictures of Berlin at the end of the war. Shortly before, it had been a thriving modern city. But after carpet bombing by the Allies, we see a burnt-out ruin. I've shown the pictures of Dresden before. It was totally devastated, and there were no military targets there. Carpet bombing is completely indiscriminate. It kills everything in its path. In Japan, it was even worse. On a single night, March 9th, 1945, an American firebombing raid on Tokyo resulted in 100,000 deaths, more than the atomic bombs of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was not for nothing that William Tecumseh Sherman said, "War is hell." I'm not condemning the American action in bombing Tokyo and Berlin or the Allied bombing of Dresden. They had to break the will to fight on of those that they were fighting. Had they not done so, Germany and Japan would have kept fighting. Ultimately, the airmen flying those bombers were fighting for freedom, and not just for England and America, but for the whole world. Eventually, that freedom would extend to the now peaceful and highly prosperous nations of Germany and Japan. It would have been better to have avoided it entirely, but Germany and Japan started a terrible war. The violence that rained down on them was of their own making, and so it is with Hamas, except that there have been no carpet bombings or fire bombings. In Gaza, every attempt has been made to mitigate against civilian casualties, even to the point of endangering Israelis. Can you justify this kind of war? Yes. If you can justify your existence, you can justify self-defense, especially when you live in as tough a neighborhood as Israel's. You know, folks, when I wrote The Late Great Planet Earth back in 1969, there were certain prophetic themes that I knew had to happen before the Lord would come for the church and end the church age. One of the most important, of course, was that Israel, no matter how much it was attacked by its neighbors, would continue to be a strong nation, even though they would be up against ever more increasingly dangerous neighbors fighting them, trying to annihilate them. Certainly, that has continued. I believe that we see in recent developments how Israel is eventually going to have someone step in to help them, even though they've fought valiantly up until this time. Also, I talked about the fact that before the end of the church age would begin the 7-year tribulation, I said that America had to fade as a world power. I didn't know exactly how, but I knew that the United States is not predicted in any of the scenario about things that would happen just before the return of Christ. And so I, with great grief, had to predict that America would cease to be a world power and fade from being a dominant power in the last days. That's exactly what's happening right now. And I said that Russia would eventually, against its better judgment, fall into an alliance with a power that would be headed by Persia or modern Iran. We see all of that fitting together in an ever increasing rapidity. I believe that we are about to come to that point where all of the things that were predicted as signs before Christ would return are right before us. I don't see how history can go on much longer before Christ comes for the church. And that's why I say, be ready. Make sure that right now you know that if Christ came now, that he would take you up with all the believers. If you haven't received the gift of pardon that Jesus Christ died to make free to you, then right now, just simply tell him, Lord, I'm a sinner, but right now, I receive the gift of pardon that you died to give to me. Come into my life and make my life what you want it to be. Do that right now. And God willing. I'll see you next week.
You've been watching the Hal Lindsey Report. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.